A motorcycle slammed into the guardrail and threw its rider across the wet asphalt. The bike kept sliding, sparks flying, until it stopped in the ditch. The man didn't move. Blood ran from his leg in a steady pulse, mixing with the rain spreading fast across the road. Headlights swung around the bend. Brakes screamed. A car door flew open and someone dropped to his knees in the water beside the dying stranger. Two hands pressed down hard on the wound. "Stay with me," the kneeling man said. "You're not dying tonight." That man was Silas Corcoran, a former war medic himself, and he had no idea that the life he was about to save would one day fill an empty chapel with 200 leather-clad strangers. Why would hardened outlaws ride hundreds of miles to bury a poor old man everyone else forgot? Stay with me on this one. The room where Silas Corcoran died measured about 8 feet by 10. There was a narrow bed, one wooden chair, a hot plate on a crate, a window that looked out on a brick wall. That was the whole of what a man had left after 79 years of living. But there was one more thing in that room: a dog. He lay on the floor by the radiator, a big German shepherd with a torn ear and a long scar running down one flank. His name was Boone, and years back Silas had found him half dead in a highway ditch, hit by a car and left to bleed out in the weeds. Most people would have driven past. Silas stopped. He wrapped the dog in his own coat, drove him to a vet 40 miles off, and paid for the surgery with money he did not have. From that day on, wherever Silas went, Boone went too. Now here's the thing you have to understand about Silas. He was the quietest man in Millville, Pennsylvania. The kind of man you'd pass on the sidewalk and never remember. He'd been a combat medic once, in a war most people had already forgotten. Came home, worked the steel mills until the mills shut down, and then just faded into the background of a dying town like a lot of men did. He never married, never had kids. He paid his rent on time in cash, said good morning to the landlady, and kept to himself. Every morning he walked Boone down to the diner on Grant Avenue, bought one coffee, and split a single fried egg with the dog. Every evening he fed Boone first, then himself. Always in that order. Believe me, that tells you everything you need to know about who Silas was. The people of Millville knew him the way you know a stray cat. They knew he existed. They didn't know his story. Nobody did. He'd give his gloves to a kid at the bus stop in January and never say a word about it. He shoveled the walk for the widow 2 doors down for 11 winters and never once knocked to be thanked. When the church ran short on their heating bill, an envelope of cash showed up under the door. No name. Folks guessed. Nobody ever proved it was him. The morning he died, Boone wouldn't stop barking. The landlady, a heavy-set woman named Edna, banged on the door around 9. No answer. Just the dog barking and scratching at the wood. She got her key. She pushed the door open. And there was Silas, sitting up in the chair by the window with his hands folded in his lap, gone sometime in the night, peaceful, like he just decided it was time. Boone lay down beside the chair and put his head on Silas's boot and would not move. Now when an old man dies alone with no family and no money, the county steps in. There's a process for it, a cold paperwork kind of process. They call it a pauper's burial, a plain pine box. A plot in the far corner of the cemetery with a little metal marker stamped with a number instead of a name. No service, really, just a body in the ground and a line closed out on a spreadsheet somewhere. The county clerk pulled Silas's file. No next of kin, no savings, no burial insurance. Nothing but a rented room, a scarred dog, and a canvas medic's bag under the bed that nobody bothered to open. So the clerk stamped the form, scheduled the burial for Thursday morning, and moved on to the next name in the stack. That should have been the end of it. An old man nobody knew, buried in a corner nobody visits, forgotten before the dirt even settled. The funeral home that handled the county cases was a small one run by a man named Dale Prewitt. He'd buried a lot of forgotten people, It never got easier, but he'd learned to keep a professional distance. You had to in that work. He arranged for the chapel to be open Thursday at 10, more out of habit than expectation. He knew how these went. Nobody comes to a pauper's funeral. Nobody. There was one small problem, though: the dog. Boone would not leave Sela's. When the county men came to take the body, the shepherd stood over him and bared his teeth, and the men backed off. Edna finally calmed him, but the dog followed the hearse. Followed it all the way to the funeral home, trotting behind on the shoulder of the road for 3 miles in the cold. And when Pruitt saw that, something in him cracked a little. He let the dog inside. He let Boone lie down beside the closed casket in the empty chapel. And that is exactly where things stood on Thursday morning. A plain box. A tired old pastor named Reverend Hollis, a funeral director who'd seen too much, and a scarred dog lying on the floor, waiting for a man who was never getting up again. The stakes were simple. A good man, a man who had quietly carried half his town on his back, was about to be dropped in a hole and forgotten forever, with not one living soul to say his name out loud. This is where it turns. 10 o'clock came. The chapel was empty. Reverend Hollis stood at the front with his worn Bible, looking out at rows of polished pews with not one person sitting in them. Dale Pruitt stood by the door. Boone lay by the casket. Dust drifted in the gray light coming through the windows. Somewhere outside, a truck rolled by on Route 8 and faded off into the distance. Hollis cleared his throat. He'd done 100 of these. He knew the words by heart. He figured he'd say them to the empty room, the way you say a prayer over a grave with nobody there but God. He opened the book. He took a breath, and that's when he heard it. Low at first. So low he thought it was a furnace kicking on in the basement, a rumble down under the floorboards, in his chest, in his teeth. He stopped and lifted his head. Pruitt turned toward the door. Boone's ears went up. The sound grew. It wasn't the furnace. It was coming from outside, from up the road, and it was getting louder every second. A deep, rolling thunder, the kind you feel before you hear. Pruitt stepped to the window and looked out, and his mouth fell open. Motorcycles. Not 2 or 3. A river of them. Coming down Grant Avenue in a long, dark line that stretched back further than he could see. Headlights on in the gray morning. Engines hammering the air until the chapel windows buzzed in their frames. They came around the bend and into the gravel lot, one after another, filling every open space, spilling out onto the road, and still they kept coming. Reverend Hollis walked to the window on legs that had gone a little unsteady. He counted the first 20 and gave up. Leather vests, gray beards, tattoos and boots, and hard, weathered faces. On the back of every single vest was the same patch, the death's head, the winged skull, Hell's Angels. The whole town heard it. Doors opened up and down Grant Avenue. People stepped out onto their porches in their robes and their coats to see what in the world was rolling into sleepy little Millville. Cars slowed on Route 8. Kids pressed their faces to school windows. By the time the last bike shut off its engine, there had to be 200 of them out there, standing in the gravel in the cold, and a crowd of confused townsfolk gathering at a safe distance, whispering, wondering if they ought to call somebody. Pruitt gripped the doorframe. Hollis just stared. Neither man had any idea what was about to walk through that door or why. Who were these men? What could they possibly want with Silas Corcoran, a man who, as far as anyone in that town knew, had never so much as ridden a motorcycle in his life? The engines died all at once, and then it was quiet, terribly, completely quiet. The riders formed up in the lot. No shouting, no chaos. They moved like men who had done this before, like men who knew exactly why they'd come. And then the chapel doors opened and they began to file in. They came in slow, hats off, heads bowed. Big men, most of them past 60, some of them well past it, moving with the stiffness of old injuries and hard miles. They filled the front pew, then the next, then the next. When the pews were full, they lined the walls, shoulder to shoulder, all the way around the room until that little empty chapel that had held 3 living souls and a dog was packed so tight you couldn't have fit one more body inside. Every one of them faced the plain pine box at the front, every one of them silent. Reverend Hollis found his voice barely. He looked at the sea of leather and gray and asked the only question he had. "Gentlemen, did you know this man?" And from the back a voice answered, low, rough, steady, "We knew him." The crowd parted and a man came forward from the rear of the chapel. He was tall and broad, somewhere in his 70s, with a long gray beard and a face carved up by decades of sun and wind and trouble. His vest was the most worn of all of them, faded near white at the shoulders. On his chest was a patch that read President. When he moved, 200 men went still. He walked up the center aisle slowly, and every eye in the room followed him. He stopped at the casket. He laid one big scarred hand flat on the lid, gentle, the way you touch a sleeping child. He stood like that for a long moment with his head down. Then he did something nobody expected. He got down on one knee, right there on the chapel floor, and he turned to the dog. Boone had been watching him the whole time, tense, uncertain. But the old man reached out slow and let the shepherd smell his hand, and something passed between them, some understanding, and Boone leaned his big head into that scarred palm and let out a long, shaking breath. "There you go," the old man said quietly. "There you go, boy. I've got him now." And for a moment, one strange, still moment, the whole thing felt finished. The thunder was gone. The lot was quiet. 200 men stood with their heads bowed and their hats in their hands, and the tired pastor felt his shoulders come down from around his ears. He thought, all right. They came to pay respects. They knew him somehow, and they came to see him off, and now we'll have our quiet little service after all. Whatever this was, the worst of it had passed. He was wrong. It hadn't even started yet. The gray-bearded president rose to his feet. He turned and faced the room, and his eyes moved across every man in it, and then out to the doorway where the townsfolk had crept up close to look inside. And when he spoke, his voice was not soft anymore. "Before anybody puts this man in the ground," he said, "every soul in this town is going to hear what he did. Because you people buried a hero and you didn't even know his name." A murmur went through the crowd at the door. And then the president raised his hand toward the back of the chapel, and the men there stepped aside, and something rolled forward through the gap. A wheelchair. In it sat another old man, thin and pale, one leg ending just below the knee. His hands shook in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the casket, and they were already wet. Another rider pushed him up the aisle to the front, and he reached out one trembling hand and touched the pine box, and a sound came out of him that no one in that chapel would ever forget. A broken, grieving sound. The sound of a man who has been waiting 50 years to say goodbye. The whole town leaned in, because now they understood. This wasn't just respect. This was something else. Something with roots that went down deep and far back, into a past that Silas Corcoran had never once spoken about. I want you to stop for just a second. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button, because what this quiet old man did on a rainy road 50 years ago is the reason 200 outlaws crossed 4 states in the cold to stand over his casket. And I promise you, you are not ready for it. The president put his hand on the shoulder of the man in the wheelchair. Then he looked at Reverend Hollis and he said, "This is Daniel Vance. 50 years ago, he was 22 years old and he was dead, bleeding out on the side of a highway in the middle of the night. And your Silas Corcoran is the only reason he's sitting here today." The room was so quiet you could hear Boone breathing. But this is where it changed shape entirely, because the president wasn't finished, and what he said next turned a funeral into a reckoning. He looked out at the townspeople, and then he looked at Dale Pruitt, and he asked, "What did this county plan to do with him? Tell me exactly." Pruitt swallowed. He looked at the file in his hands. "A county burial," he said. "The pine box. A plot in the back corner, a marker with a number on it. A number, the president repeated. Not a name. A number. He let that hang in the air. And when he spoke again, there was iron in it. This man kept your church warm. This man dug your widows out of the snow. This man gave a dying stranger back his whole life and asked for nothing, not one thing, not even to be thanked. And you were going to stamp a number on him and forget he ever lived. Nobody in that doorway could meet his eyes. That is not happening, the president said. Not today, not to him. The Millville plot gets closed out. We bury him. We pay for all of it. A real casket. A real stone with his name cut deep enough to last 100 years. Full honors. And this whole town is going to stand out there in the cold and watch, and learn who they had living among them all this time. It wasn't a request. 200 men behind him made sure of that. But there was nothing to fight about, really, because the moment the words were out, the shame in that room was so thick you could have leaned on it. Reverend Holly stepped forward, and his own eyes were wet now, and he said, "Then tell us. Tell us who he was, please." The president nodded. He walked back to the casket. He reached into his vest and took out something small, and he held it up so the light caught it. A set of dog tags on a beaded chain. Old ones, dented, dark with age. And here's the thing, they weren't the president's tags. The name stamped into that metal was Corcoran. He pressed them into his palm and closed his fist around them. And then he told the story. The whole story. And this is where you're going to want to hold on. It was 1971 he began. October. Cold rain coming down hard on a stretch of state highway out past the mountains, the kind of night where you can't see 10 feet in front of your own headlight. I was 22 and stupid, and I was riding too fast. A car came around the bend into my lane, and I laid the bike down to miss it, and I went into the guardrail at 50 miles an hour. He paused. The chapel didn't breathe. I don't remember the crash. I remember the road. I remember lying in the water with my leg opened up to the bone, and the blood going out of me so fast I could feel myself getting cold from the inside. The car that ran me off, it never even slowed down. I lay there in the dark and the rain, and I knew all the way down that I was going to die on that road, and nobody was ever going to know what happened to me. He looked down at Daniel Vance, and the man in the wheelchair was weeping openly now. And then there were headlights. The president went on. A car stopped. A door opened. And a man came running through the rain and dropped down in the water beside me. Just an ordinary man on his way home from a night shift. He took one look at my leg, and he didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. And I found out later it was because he'd done this before, 100 times in a war on the other side of the world. He'd been a medic. His hands knew exactly what to do. He pressed down on the wound with everything he had. He tied it off with his own belt. He talked to me the whole time. "Stay with me," he kept saying. "You're not dying tonight, not on my watch. Look at me, stay with me." And Lord help me, I did. I held onto that man's voice like it was a rope out of a river. The ambulance was 40 minutes out. 40 minutes in that rain on that road. Most men would have done what they could and waited. Not him. He knew I didn't have 40 minutes. So he picked me up, all 200 pounds of me, and he loaded me into the back of his own car, and he drove me down that mountain in the dark faster than any sane man would, one hand on the wheel, one hand reaching back to keep the pressure on my leg. He drove me straight to the emergency room doors, and he carried me in himself, soaked in my blood, shouting for help. The president's voice caught. He steadied it. The doctors said another 10 minutes and I'd have been gone. 10 minutes. That's how close it was. They took my leg below the knee, but they saved my life. And the only reason there was a life left to save was that stranger in the rain. He held up the dog tags again. Before they wheeled me back, while I was fading in and out, he took these off his own neck and he pressed them into my hand. His own tags. And he said, "You hold on to these. And when you're back on your feet, you find me and you give them back to me in person. That's the deal. You owe me that." He was trying to give me a reason to live. He was giving me a promise to keep. And then he was gone. When I woke up 2 days later, he'd vanished. No name at the desk, no address. He'd told the nurses he was nobody, just a guy who happened by. He didn't want the thanks. He didn't want the money my family tried to give. He just wanted me to live, and once I was going to, his work was done. The president closed his fist around the tags one more time. I spent 50 years looking for him, 50 years. So did every brother in this room and their fathers before them. Because a man who saves one of us saves all of us, and a debt like that does not get forgotten, not ever, not in this life. We had one clue, the name on these tags, Corcoran. But the man had moved on, changed towns, gone quiet the way he did with everything. Wrong Corcorans in every state. Dead ends for half a century. I made a promise to a dying man to put these back in his hand, and I could not find him to keep it. His voice broke all the way now, and he did not try to hide it. 2 weeks ago, one of our younger brothers was passing through this town, and he stopped at a diner for a coffee, and he got to talking with a waitress about an old man who used to come in every morning and split an egg with his dog. An old man who never talked about himself. An old man who'd been a war medic once, long ago. And she mentioned his name. The president looked at the casket. Corcoran. He laid his hand on the lid again. I got here 4 days too late, he said quietly. 4 days. After 50 years, I missed him by 4 days. I never got to put these back in his hand. I never got to look him in the eye and say thank you. I never got to tell him that the scared kid on that road grew up and got clean and led good men, and lived a whole entire life that only happened because he stopped his car in the rain. He knelt down one more time, slow, his old knees protesting, and he opened the small door at the head of the casket where a man's hands would rest. And he laid the dog tags gently inside against Silas Corcoran's still hands and folded them closed. Here, he whispered. I brought them back, just like I promised. You can rest now. Then the president stood, and he turned to face the room. And behind him, every one of those 200 hard old men had tears cutting down through the dust and the years on their faces, and not one of them was ashamed of it. And out in the doorway, the people of Millville, the neighbors who'd passed Silas on the street for years and never once asked his name, were weeping too. The widow he'd shoveled out. The kid, grown now, who'd worn his gloves. The pastor whose church he'd kept warm. Reverend Hollis wiped his face and opened his Bible, and this time when he spoke the words over Silas Corcoran, the chapel was full to the walls, and every soul in it knew exactly whose name it was hearing. They did not put Silas Corcoran in a corner with a number. The Hell's Angels paid for all of it, just as their president said, a proper casket, a plot up on the hill under an old oak where the morning light comes through, and a headstone of real granite cut deep that reads, Silas Corcoran, medic. He stopped in the rain. Underneath, in smaller letters, they added 4 more words, never rode alone again. When they carried him out of that chapel, they would not let the funeral men touch the box. 8 of the oldest riders shouldered it themselves, slow and careful, out into the gray morning and down the steps. And the same scarred hands that had once been a young man bleeding on a highway now helped carry the man who'd saved him. The circle closed, right there in the cold in front of the whole town. They rode him to the cemetery 200 strong, engines low and rolling, headlights on, a river of leather flowing through the middle of a town that would never forget this day as long as it stood. People lined Grant Avenue. Old men who'd served put their hands over their hearts. Mothers held their children up to see. And at the front of that long dark procession, in a truck driven slow, rode a scarred German shepherd with his head out the window and the wind in his torn ears. Because there was still the matter of Boone. A dog like that, a dog who followed a hearse 3 miles down a cold road and lay by a casket for a day and a night. That dog was not going to any shelter. The president settled it before they even reached the graveside. He knelt down in the grass in front of the shepherd, the same way he'd knelt in that chapel, and he said, "You kept watch over him to the end, didn't you? All right, now you ride with us. You're one of ours now, same as he was. Boone went home with the club that day. And I'm told that old dog lived out his years fat and happy in a garage full of men who'd have done anything for him, riding in a sidecar with goggles on his snout, the most spoiled shepherd in 4 states. Every one of those riders knew whose dog he'd been. Every one of them treated him like it. At the graveside, the president spoke one last time. It was short. He was all out of big words by then, and sometimes the short ones land the deepest anyway. 50 years ago, a man I never met stopped his car for me, he said. He didn't know me. I couldn't do a thing for him. There was nothing in it for him but the cold and the rain and a stranger's blood on his hands. And he stopped anyway. That's the whole thing right there. That's everything. Any man can do the right thing when it pays. It takes somebody rare to do it when nobody's watching and nobody will ever know. He looked around at the town gathered on the hill. You had a rare one living right here among you, he said. Take better care of the next one. They lowered Silas Corcoran into the ground under the oak tree, and 200 engines fired up at once and revved into the gray sky, a thunder you could hear clear across the valley, the loudest goodbye that quiet man ever got. And then, one by one, they rode off down the mountain and were gone. Here's what stays with me about the whole thing, and I think it'll stay with you too. Silas never told a soul. Not the diner, not the church, not the widow, not one person in that town for all those years. He carried the biggest thing he ever did folded up small inside him, and he never once took it out to be admired. He fed his dog before he fed himself. He gave his gloves away in the cold. He stopped his car in the rain for a stranger, and then he drove off before anyone could learn his name. That was just who he was, all the way down, whether anyone was watching or not. And that's the thing about the forgotten ones. Sometimes the man that nobody knows is the man who once held somebody else's whole life in his 2 hands on the side of a dark road and never said a word about it after. Silas Corcoran died thinking no one was coming. 200 came. They just took 50 years and 4 days to get there. And when they did, they filled every pew and lined every wall and cut his name into stone so deep that 100 years from now, someone will still be able to run their fingers over it and read it out loud. He stopped in the rain. Rest easy, medic. You never rode alone.